Just to explain something about the format for the evening, Edmund is going to first talk to some slides for about half an hour or so, and then I'll have a short conversation with him, and we'll invite you to take part in that conversation as well. So Edmund's going to lead off first of all, and I'm going to make myself scarce momentarily. And
thank you, Alan. Thank you, Joe. Luckily, it's so dark, I can't see how many people are here, which is so nice. And in honor of being... I'm not wearing a suit. This is the first time I haven't worn a suit when I've talked in years. So I am feeling very good to be here at the V&A, launching a beautiful, discreet book and talking about what I really do, which is making pots, and really talking about some of my life with pots, some of the things that I spent my teenage life down the corridor, up the stairs, looking into vitrines, like any good teenager should, at pots. For so long, are pots which are Chinese and pots which are Korean, and wonderful, wonderful English slipware, and this kind of pot, wonderful vernacular English pots, and Japanese pots, and trying to work out, as a teenager, starting my apprenticeship down in Canterbury with a wonderful potter called Geoffrey Whiting, what made a modern potter? To be 14, obsessing about this. And I knew that to be a modern potter, I had to think about people like Shoji Hamada, the great Japanese potter. Here, my favorite photograph of him in his Eames chair. A potter who made extraordinary gestural pots, pots that were alive to movement and scale, but also pots that had colour of the earth around them, pots that seemed to say something about rootedness and place. When I was 17, I went away to Japan and came back and knew that this was the kind of pottery I had to make. I was apprenticed. This is leechware, and this is the apprenticeship I had, making every single one of these pots. I can still be folded and make you a honey pot, and make you another and another and another, because, as Geoffrey said on the first day of my apprenticeship, the first 30,000 pots you make are the worst. And as he said, it doesn't matter about being contemporary. Your contemporaries are in the V&A. They're up there in the Korean galleries, amongst the Chinese pots, and there with the English slipware. And this is what I consumed every night, reading a potter's book, and I could still sketch for you the perfect workshop that Leach says you should have, how you go in. This is the Bible for potters. But it was slightly more complicated for me, because when I was reading this, I was also reading this, reading poetry, Ezra Pound, going to Cambridge and trying to be a poet too. But then, like all good potters, I took myself off to the Welsh borders and made terrible brown pots. And they really were terrible brown pots. You're very privileged. This is a slide which is going to be on and then will disappear. And my wife reminded me today that when we moved in together, I made her throw away all my brown pots. And here are my apprenticeship pots. Lots and lots of casseroles. Lots and lots of under-fired Temuku pots. And then, actually this makes me feel so nostalgic. They were so bad, so heavy. And Herefordshire is still knocking around with lots and lots of these vessels. But then came my urban experience, taking myself off to Sheffield, to a back street near Attercliffe, and attempting to make urban porcelain in my workshop. And there I am, at the bottom of Roby Street, making porcelain that, again, no one wanted, but trying to think of a way of articulating cereal pots, not with a C but with an S, seriality. How do you make repetition work? How do you make things which are as beautiful and as clean and as clear and as modern and as truly contemporary as wonderful Bauhaus pots? These extraordinary pots that were made at the turn of the 1920s and made with such rigor. How do you make sense of this extraordinary Malevich teapot, which doesn't pour, but actually is an expression of whiteness, of purity, of different zones coming together with energy? How do you make sense of all these things and still make pots? 15 years ago, I remember it because it was the year after my second child was born, I had an invitation from the Jeffrey Museum. And they said, you have a room, 15 feet by 15 feet and 10 feet high. What are you going to do? And on the turn of the breath, I said, I'm going to make a porcelain room. Now, porcelain rooms, the last time a porcelain room had been made was in 1760 in Sicily, a terrible confection of Baroque porcelain. But here, this is my porcelain room, my Porzellankammer, and it's full of rigor, and it's full of different bits of porcelain music, bits of seriality. This is my bit of Bach. And I did my first attic, my first space where I tucked things away in the darkness and put things in the ground and tried to make sense of a whole work of art, a kind of way of making porcelain which is a whole sculpture, a whole thing, not just a singular object, though everything is ultimately singular when you sit down early in the morning with a lump of clay, but plural. What happens when you do make things one after the other after the other? How do you make sense of your life with plurality? And how do you make sense of all the untidiness of that? The things, the odds and ends that don't make sense. You put them into an attic. You put them away somewhere tenebrous and try and make them exist like that. And interestingly, immediately I got complaints after this exhibition was opened by people saying they couldn't see what was going on. Why wasn't it properly lit? That's the point. Not everything in light is properly lit. But what can be lit is that extraordinary moment, that moment of rapture, when suddenly an object is isolated with another object, when suddenly you see how different kinds of objects have a synapse of energy between them and are brought together and held together. They can be held on a picture frame, on a picture plane like Morandi or Zubran, or indeed with the invitation from the V&A, you can hold them very high up indeed. You can hold them in the dome of a museum. You can make your own. This is me looking absolutely terrified. It's so high up, and I absolutely hate heights. You can hold them so high up that actually you can't see them all at the same time. And that has value too, because what that means is that you move with the pots. You have to move round and round and round if you want to see what's up there. Which, of course, is what happens with collections and museums. You move all the time. So that feeling of how you bring porcelain, my material, together with space, with architecture, is something that I have been obsessing about, both in big ways and perhaps in small ways. This is the bit that fell off from the V&A. And while I'm doing this stuff with porcelain, I'm writing and thinking about how words and pages come together with the pots that I'm making. The origins of silent reading is this piece. And actually, that makes sense for me. As I talk about it, I realize that most people seem to go completely blank when I say that making and writing are the same thing. It's not just that when I see a text, a page, a palimpsest, this is Proust's Proofs, Walter Benjamin's Notes and Archives, and of course a part of the Torah. What I'm seeing is the relationship between words, the spaces and synapses that I feel, I don't conceptualize, I feel them when I'm making. When I'm making a group of pots and put them down next to me by the wheel, it feels like words. It feels like phrases of music. So how, when you see the Torah and you read the Torah, do you make something which has its own kind of structure, its own sense of being a collection, of being a series of spaces in the world which are held in some kind of way, either behind glass, which makes it a vitrine, which of course is interesting and problematic for me as the person who writes rather lengthily about why vitrines matter, but also the open object. And what happens when things go wrong? You cross them out, you rewrite them. You have errata. But errata, things that go wrong, also have an extraordinary value in the world. And this museum, this fabulous museum, is full of errata. It's full of things which are wrong, that have made one kind of attempt at life and changed direction. And so given the opportunity to work with Cambridge, with a very argumentative group of academics for a new building in Cambridge, I gave them some vitrines in the ground which are full of errata, full of things that have gone wrong for them to argue over. These are my archival vitrines. They have to stumble across them on their way in to disagree with each other. And sometimes you can see things when the sun is out in Cambridge, both those days, and sometimes when it's rainy and full of leaves, they disappear again, which of course is exactly what happens with art. Sometimes it's there, and sometimes it wants to disappear. And actually this idea of disappearing, this idea of how present does something have to be real in the world, is something that, of course, I become more and more obsessed about. It's something that I've tried to articulate when working with slightly grander buildings, like this extraordinary place, Waddesdon, this faux French chateau stranded in the Buckinghamshire countryside, where the invitation to make something to add to Waddesdon, just hear that phrase, to add, to bring something in to those stuffed interiors, was an opportunity to try and look at how things survive. What do you do? This is at winter when the house is put to bed. Where can you put things in this house which is so full of Sèvres, so full of silver, so full of extraordinary paintings, all of which are saying that a family is no longer a wandering family, but a good, rooted English European family? What do? You hide things. You make things which have some kind of presence, and then you bring them into this extraordinary stuffed, gilded space, and you try and make them disappear, which again seems to annoy people. This is not my shtick, I have to say, but actually, why does everything have to be well lit? Sometimes things can just float their way through life. Sometimes it's impossible to actually make sure that people see things because they're so busy reading labels that if you take the labels away, all you have are the books.